everybody wants clean water. Who doesn't want clean water from their Forest Service? But I don't think people realize that comes from public lands, right? A huge amount of your drinking water is filtered and comes from your public land. So don't screw it up. What we're trying to conserve there with this roadless rule is making sure that we're not cutting more roads that are going to require maintenance into these prime backcountry areas that are really essential for the wildlife, the fish that we like to pursue, but just, biodiversity and the kind of backcountry character that we all know and love.
Recently, I had an opportunity to sit down with Devin O'Dea, Western Policy and Conservation Manager for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, for conversation about the Roadless Rule, the North American model of conservation, and the future of public lands. Look, if you love public lands as much as I do, you're going to want to tune into this episode. Get ready. It's time to enter the Wild Lab. Welcome back to the Wild Lab, everybody. I'm your host, Ned Widener, and Today we have a friend and fellow hunter, Devin O'Dea. He is the Western Policy and Conservation Manager for BHA, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, which it's an organization that I know and love, and devoted to conservation on public lands, waters, wildlife. It's a really, really great organization, and it's really actually a real pleasure to have Devin on in the podcast studio, although I'd prefer to have him in the woods hunting next to me, which we'll hopefully make happen soon. Devin, how are you today, brother? It's gonna happen, man. How are you today, brother?
I'm good. Yeah. Busy but good, and very stoked to chat with you, but certainly hope that the next time it is, like you said, around a campfire or chasing some sort of critter on the east side there of California. That's high on my hit list.
Yeah, man. Yeah, we definitely got to make it happen. So for folks who don't know, so like I said, you're the Western Policy and Conservation Manager for BHA. And I know there's a lot of folks listening to this podcast that are members of BHA and listen and understand what it is. But I also know there's quite a few folks who don't. So could you just, for people who don't know what Backcountry Hunters or who Backcountry Hunters and Anglers are and what it is, the work that you all do, can you enlighten the listeners, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So BHA is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are a North America-wide organization. So we've got chapters in 48 states, a couple Canadian provinces and territories. And we are a grassroots membership-based organization. And I try to describe our work really kind of in two ways, where there's sort of like, on one hand, BHA has its advocacy work. And so we're working at, the state and federal level to support or oppose policies that, impact hunters and anglers, but particularly wild public lands, waters, and wildlife. And so, that's work that we do to mobilize our grassroots base to be engaged in policy making and to, use their voice for what they care about and the places they like to recreate. And then the other hand of the work that we do is our stewardship work. And that's, actually getting on the ground, doing habitat restoration projects, doing public land trash pack outs. The range of stewardship projects that we do is really vast, but they all center around, our wild public lands and waters and projects that improve habitat typically for fish and wildlife that we like to go out and pursue. And of course, there's always a number of secondary benefits across the spectrum, just for biodiversity and all the species that are kind of interconnected when you work on these different types of habitat projects.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're creating ecosystems and better habitats for bears or for deer or sage grouse or whatever, you're creating better ecosystems and habitats for a lot of different animals, not just the target species that you're hoping to help, but you're just creating better ecosystems. And I mean, that's one of the things that, like, honestly, that brought me to BHA, that brought me to the work that you all are doing. Because look, let's face it, there's a lot of organizations out there doing a lot of really great work with conservation and with hunters and anglers and whatnot. But it really, to me, at least from my perspective, what you all do really centers the conservation, the land, the wildlife, first and foremost, which I think is just so very important. And so I just want to say I appreciate the work that you guys do at BHA. Um, just really important.
Yeah, I think on that note too, just the thing that I love about those stewardship projects,
Hmm.
and the sort of like ripple benefits or the tangential connections that are made is that, you do a project that's primarily driven towards restoring habitat for mule deer or pronghorn or, migratory herds. But because there's so many other layers, you end up bringing in people that are there because they care about pollinators, or folks that are
Hmm.
there just because they're passionate about native plants. And then you start to bring these communities together that are like kind of these disparate entities into like one cohesive group that's just, working towards the conservation of public lands and waters. And that's where I think a lot of the really like special relationships and bonds are formed there. And I think from there, that builds into the policy work, right? So it's like
Hmm.
on the ground, these different people come together and realize like, oh, we all care about the same thing. And then it ripples back out when you're actually advocating. And you realize that you have these allies in these different communities, and that, there's those shared priorities that can help to leverage the work that you're trying to convince policymakers of the importance, and these different groups that can come together over various issues.
Yeah, man. Yeah, no, and I mean, I've been lucky enough to be a part of as you know, a few different BHA stewardship programs. You know, or projects, not programs, but projects. The what would you guys call it? The bitter brush bands, bitter brush, and you're gonna have to the thing
Uh,
we did at
uh,
Hallelujah
be-
Junction.
Beer bans and bitter brush stands.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, I always got the title of it wrong, right? But I love that because we're out there. I mean, it was hot the days that I was out there, but you're out there in the heat and, either collecting bitter brush seed or planting these bitter brush on, fire ravaged Hallelujah Junction. And it was really just a hodgepodge of a lot of different people, coming together to help restore a land that was really degraded by fire and had been, over the years. And so, I mean, I think it's just an example of some of the great work that you guys do over there.
Yeah, and I think again, like one of my favorite moments from that event, which we've done for a few years running, is when one of our California BHA board members on his way up there went out and actually harvested a black
Oh
bear,
yeah.
in California, and then brought it to the event. Um, and we cooked it up because we had like a big wild game potluck, and it was like, hey, perfect, we got this, wild bear here. Let's add that to the mix. And then there were a number of folks there who were actually vegans who were excited about trying black bear, and so we had a number of folks try eat meat and try bear for the first time. And I think it just speaks. It's kind of a perfect example there of different groups who would maybe never really see eye to eye on certain things, but
Hmm.
when you frame it in the right context, and you realize that people are not necessarily going out like trophy hunting, in
Hmm.
parentheses for some of these different species, and they're actually going out there to provide a good source of protein and cook it up in a delicious way. We did a beer for another tongue twister for you. That project name's a tongue twister, but I got an even better one. We made the beer braised bear back straps with like a homemade fig and wine reduction that went
Oh
on top
wow.
of it, and it was. I
Nice.
mean, it's hard to say no to that wherever you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I think I don't know who killed that bear, but as I told you, I'm on my way up to the AFI, or the AFI was the Armed Forces Initiative, Eastern Sierra Bear Camp, and to help out up there actually tomorrow, or right tonight, but it starts tomorrow. And yeah, I don't. We might be serving some of that exact bear that was killed that day. I know that we're serving up some bear tacos that I'm in charge of cooking, and I think it's maybe from that bear. So yeah,
That would be cool. Yeah, it was a tasty one. That was a good eating
yeah,
bear.
yeah. Right on, man. Well, listen. I want to talk about BHA. I do want to talk more about, some of the major threats that are facing public lands, especially in the West. The roadless rule, corner crossing. We can even get into black bear hunting in California a little bit if you want. But I really want to know because I think a lot of big part of this podcast is understanding the people that are behind things, right? And so I'd love to hear your journey as a hunter, like what got you into hunting? Because I know it was, or I think rather, it was you're an adult onset hunter, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or at least came to it later in your life. So I'd love to hear your journey with hunting, man, and hunting and fishing, and like, yeah, tell me a little bit about like what it has provided you in your own life.
Yeah, I like the term that I will credit to Eric Hansen, who's
Mm,
the chair of the California BHA board, as an emergent hunter. Uh,
yeah,
that's the way he likes to frame that. Adult onset sounds like some sort of disease, you know. He always said it.
I don't
So,
like it either. Yeah.
um, anyways, I'll continue to try to credit Eric with coining that phrase. But I got into hunting when I like after I graduated college, shortly
Hmm.
thereafter, and picked up bow hunting first. But have been fishing since basically since I could walk, and was really into backcountry trips and trying to go after wild trout in the mountains of California and Trinity
Hmm.
Alps and Tuolumne Meadows, and just kind of out and about in different places that I was able to explore as a kid. And that led me into abalone diving and spearfishing, and that was a really big part of my upbringing. And particularly in college, I basically spearfished my way through college, feeding myself, supplementing my beer
Hmm.
money diet with wild proteins. And from there, I picked up archery, and I did it a little bit as a kid, but like really fell back in love with it. I had a family friend give me a bow, and just kind of trained for about a year with my bow until I felt like I was proficient enough to go back out in the woods. And always loved
Hmm.
cooking fish and abalone, and those wild foods are always been my favorite. And so, yeah, I started trying to chase deer in the local mountains of San Diego. It took me 4 years to get a deer, but it wasn't in California. So hunted 4 years unsuccessfully
Mm,
for deer in California, and then went to the East Coast to hunt with a friend of my wife's family, and got 2 deer in 4 days. So I was like, well, okay, I feel a little bit better about myself as a
yeah,
hunter now. Like it's,
yeah.
maybe it's just harder. And then came back and finally got a deer in California with my bow a couple years later. But the elusive Southern California um, deer has still not materialized. My wife
Hmm,
has gotten one with her bow
really?
down here, but um, I will continue to chase them around. I actually had two deer that I glassed up the other weekend, and I was stalking in towards, and everything was great. I had the wind in my face, and then they ran off for some reason I couldn't figure out, and then I saw a coyote chasing them about like 30 seconds later. Coyote was
Mm,
about 100 yards behind, and so there's always something,
mhm,
and that's part of the love for it, right? And what keeps me coming back. But I guess to close, I'll just say that really what got me into hunting, fishing, diving, harvesting anything is just like true love of wild food, and I
mm,
really enjoy preparing it. I love sharing it with people, and that love of cooking and trying to cook something 100 different ways is like I think what keeps me coming back, and something that motivates me to try new different types of wild proteins and new
mm.
hunts, new experiences, and so kind of forever chasing that.
Yeah, so do you have a favorite wild food, man? Like, what's your favorite thing to harvest and or kill and or harvest and eat?
Without a doubt, it is abalone, which is
Mhm.
really puts me in a difficult position because
It does, yeah.
abalone has been closed for a long time in California, and they just extended the closure for a decade,
Oh, wow.
which is just it's kind of like a twist of the knife. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I grew up eating that relatively regularly. Just went diving a few times myself, but also had some family friends that were big divers, and so
Mhm.
yeah, it's a tough one to have as your favorite
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, especially in California. Yeah, but I remember when they used to have the big abalone fest up in was it up in Trinidad or whatever? I think that was up
Think
that
so,
way.
yeah.
Yeah, I went up there a couple of times. And so Yeah, super fun time up there though. Yeah. Well, so besides abalone, then, like, since you can't do that, what is it now?
So second favorite would be pronghorn.
Okay.
We I've gone to, have not successfully drawn a tag in California yet, but always put in. I went the last few years to Wyoming. My wife and I
Hmm.
drove out actually in 2020 in COVID when we had our first daughter who was just about 4 months old. We both had tags and we made the decision that we were kind of going crazy. Uh, and so we rented an RV and drove out to Wyoming, packed all of our own food. We were completely self sufficient. Like middle of the pandemic, just didn't really know what was happening with the world, but we were going to go hunt pronghorn and we were going to be self sufficient doing it. And so we both harvested two each with our bows. So we came back loaded up with four pronghorn, and ever since then it's been one of my favorite proteins. Really, my favorite yeah, wild game meat.
Yeah, it is absolutely delicious. I mean, I love bear. I think, bear like canned bear meat is one of my favorite absolute things in the world. But what's your favorite way to prepare pronghorn?
I think the best way I've ever had it is just the most simple, right? So you just have like very simple salt pepper mix, whatever you like
Mm,
to put on your steak. Montreal's is good, but something, just something salt based, and then I'll take just try to get a fire as hot as I can. And
hmm.
particularly, I had it once when it was really windy, and so we had like this like big fire, and it was really windy, and so the fire was just like hot and blowing.
Mm.
And I threw a couple of back straps just right on the fire grate, and it with the wind, it just kind of like completely seared it, just blowing that like hot air around it, and it was really the best I've ever had, I think. And so this is the most simple way to cook it, but the best.
Right on, man. Yeah. No, and I think it's really important, especially for I think it's really important to like dispel some of the myths around like wild game, especially for people who, because I've had this conversation with a number of people on this podcast, right? But there's such a disconnection between the food that we eat and on a largely on an everyday basis, and there's a lot of people who really don't have a connection to the food they eat and would love to start getting more into wild game, and it's really becoming such a much more popular thing. But then there's also sort of an access issue that people don't know how to go about doing it, or don't know how to prepare the food, or don't know how to even start getting hunting and fishing. And I also think that's another thing that Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, I think, does a really good job of doing is yeah, centering conservation, but also creating spaces where some people can, um, learn some of the basics about hunting and fishing, or at least be in a community where they can pick the brains of different people, especially if they're coming onto it, as as Eric calls it, an emergent adult hunter, or just an emergent hunter, as it were, right? Um, yeah, and so I'm curious though, man, like what we have I don't know, there's so many issues facing public lands in this right now. We just sort of faced head on um them trying to take away a large swath of public lands in North America and in the United States. But I'm curious, currently the comment period for the roadless rule just ended, I think, September 19th or September 20th or something like that, and we're recording like
Yep.
October 2nd. And they really haven't, I don't think they've done anything with the comment period yet. Maybe they won't, maybe they will. I don't know how things work necessarily, but it is it's a it is an important topic. And so I'm curious if you could, and I know it's one that BHA has been front and center with a lot, especially the past month or two. But if you can just explain to the listeners, like, what is the roadless rule, what is the importance of it, and what are the ramifications of it if it of the roadless rule if it goes away for public lands, for outdoor enthusiasts, for hunters and fishermen. Yeah, I mean, give me the lay of the land there, as it were.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. So we just came out of the initial comment period, which is pretty short as they usually go, and now we're in basically that was for the notice of intent to rescind the
Mm-hmm.
roadless rule, and so the roadless rule was first established in 2001, and so the in the initial go around there were I think about like 1.6 million people who commented on that rule, like but the vast majority, over 95%, in support of the roadless rule.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a very popular rule. Historically, that was the most people that had ever commented on a rule. And where we are today is we've got the notice of intent from the Forest Service to rescind this rule. And in approximately 6 months, there will be a draft environmental impact statement that kind of outlines the various alternatives for repealing the roadless rule. And so, in
Mm-hmm.
that process, for folks that aren't really aware of or steeped in kind of the NEPA process, which gets a bit wonky, but you have these environmental impact statements that basically outline a few different alternatives. So there will be a no action alternative. There will be an alternative that says we're going to rescind it, and we're hoping that there will be something in the middle, in between. Usually, there's a range for different NEPA policy actions. It doesn't sound like there's going to be another alternative in there to
Mm-hmm.
revise the rule, but that's something that BHA has really been advocating for. And so, just to kind of step back, what
Mm-hmm.
is the roadless rule?
Right.
It's basically a looks at inventory roadless areas that were established dating back into the 70s. And a lot of these were established, and the roadless rule really came about in part because there's a huge maintenance backlog on our existing road network.
Mm-hmm.
And just to put it in context, the number of roads that there are on current Forest Service lands, if you were to stretch them out, you could circumnavigate the globe 15 times driving those roads.
Wow.
Um,
I mean,
you can go to the moon and back almost.
it's not surprising to me since they're all winding around, different ridges and valleys and stuff. Yeah, that doesn't really surprise me, but when you put it into that
Yeah,
context,
there's a lot of
it's
roads.
amazing. Yeah.
And so, we have to maintain these roads first of all. And that's a big part of where the roadless rule came from, was just, how do we pay for maintaining these roads? And so what the
Mm-hmm.
roadless rule says is no more roads in these inventory roadless areas. And so, inventory roadless areas were also established in part in a lot of cases because they had like a lower value timber quality. And so from like a timber perspective, what we were saying is no more roads and no timber harvest, no commercial timber harvest in these areas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the core of what the roadless rule is. Now, um, there's a lot of nuance and exceptions to how that rule plays out in real life. So, in these roadless areas, there is timber harvest that is allowed. There are exceptions, particularly related to, wildfire fuels
Uh-huh.
reduction. So, mitigation work, fuels reduction work for wildlife habitat projects, restoration projects, and there are a number of exemptions. There's even in inventory roadless areas, there's 9,000 miles of existing OHV trails. You can hunt, you can fish, you can camp, you can take your horse. These are not areas, these are not synonymous with wilderness, and they're not
Right.
closed off to the public, right? They're very much open to public recreation, and they're some of the best places that you can hunt, you can chase elk, you can get into more of what we would call the backcountry,
Right.
where you are getting away from people. And I think that's the what we're trying to conserve there with this roadless rule is making sure that we're not cutting more roads that are going to require maintenance into these prime backcountry areas that are really essential for the wildlife, the fish that we like to pursue, but just biodiversity and the kind of backcountry character that we all know
Mm-hmm.
and love.
Well, so I mean, I hear you with that, but I'm curious if you can for people who may, we're talking about putting roads or maintaining roads on national forest land, right? And the historically, national forest land was developed as a multi-resource, and there's that whole fight between Gifford Pinchot and John Muir. Is it conservation? Is it preservation? Which one are we going to lean towards when it comes to the national forest? And historically, right, Pinchot obviously won that argument, and the national forest became used as resources, as so conservation won over preservation. And I'm curious to some of the, maybe naysayers, like what is the argument? I know the argument against it, which is, our national forests are meant to be used as resources, and cutting more roads into them can help possibly mitigate fire, which we all know across the Western United States is an even bigger issue. And the roadless route also limits access to getting into these places. And that's all. Another argument would be that the national forest system was designed in order to extract resources over a period of time so that we can harvest some of the timber. So I'm just curious, and I obviously I'm agreeing with you on the roadless rule, but I'm just curious, like, what the argument is um, against some of these claims, that perhaps, I don't know if these are the claims the administration is working, but I know these are some of the claims that people against the roadless rule might harbor. So I'm wondering if you can, like, respond to some things like that.
Yeah, and that really gets into like the core of the conversation and the arguments and the comments that we've made. And so,
Mm,
regarding fire, right? I think just to put it in the context, a lot of people say, well, these roadless areas, they exacerbate fire. We can't do fire mitigation. There's been 2 million acres of roadless areas that have been treated for wildfire fuel reduction work. And so, this work's going on. This is happening in roadless areas. What is being prevented are the new roads that are being constructed. And so, you know, the issue, when it comes to fire with new roads is that the vast majority of fires are caused by humans. I think the
mm,
statistics generally say about 85% of fires are caused by humans, and a huge percentage
yeah.
of those occur within about a half a mile of a road. And so
Mm,
adding roads actually exacerbates fire risk, and it's not it's working in the wrong direction, right? So I think, like,
mm-hmm,
if we're talking about, we want to do the wildfire reduction work, that's important work, and we need to keep doing that. But building new roads is just going to really exacerbate the fire risk. And a lot of the conversations that the administration has put forward regarding, the need for this is kind of like the wildland urban interface,
mm,
and how that, has changed over time, and how we need to be addressing the work in this area. And we can and need to continue to do wildfire mitigation work in the wildland urban interface, but uh, adding new roads is really just going to exacerbate, I think, the fire risk these communities, for people driving out there, dragging a chain, or just you have like a catalytic converter that truck parks on high grass, it lights on fire.
mm-hmm,
Someone throws out a cigarette butt. Like, these are how fires are started, in a huge number of cases. And so, when it comes to fire, that's really not the answer. And then when it comes to timber harvest, I think, again, like, there are these exceptions, particularly when we're talking about like healthy forests, habitat management. These activities can occur. Timber harvest can occur. It's the commercial harvest. And again, they're just, when the economic analysis comes out in these areas, they're just typically not the areas that really hold high value timber, I think, in a lot of
mm,
respects. And so, I think that is somewhat of a red herring there, and that, the general fear, right, is if we do have these roads, we're just going to be opening them up to additional types of industry. And, it's just important that there are some places that you have to work a little bit harder to get to, right? And so we don't
mm-hmm,
want to shut off access. We don't want to close these areas. We're not preservationists by any extent of the imagination, but we do feel strongly that, some places are special because you can't just drive up to them
mm-hmm,
and throw down a tent, right? You have to hike into the backcountry, and you have to,
mm-hmm,
bring your supplies, and you have to be a little bit at the mercy of the elements. And and subject to kind of like those laws of nature and be a
Mm,
little bit out of your element. And that is like that core experience that I think the roadless area can help to conserve and protect. And
yeah.
so part of what makes it so special, particularly if you're a hunter and angler, because that's oftentimes where you find the best. That's where the wildlife are. They're
Uh-huh.
away from roads,
Uh-huh.
especially when you're looking at species like elk and oftentimes with deer. So
Right, and bear especially, yeah,
yeah, bear.
they don't want to be they don't want to be anywhere near you unless they're in a unless we're talking about Mammoth or Tahoe or something like that, and then they
Right.
want to be right
Unless they're in your
next to
trash can.
you. Right, it's a different thing. Um, it's an interesting point that you brought up there, man, which is, and it's one that I struggle with a lot, and I go back and forth with a lot, and I've especially recently as I've began taking more and more people out into wilderness hunting and fishing, and exposing areas to people and exposing people to different, into the wild spaces. How do we? I don't know if you want to answer this from an individual perspective or you want to answer it from a BHA perspective. I'll leave that up to you. But like, how do we balance um, increasing access to public lands, right, and exposing more people to public lands while conserving some of these places, and also, as you said, like keeping some of these places as not necessarily, well, we can talk about wilderness, that's a slightly different topic, but keeping some of these places, um not running roads through them, not putting a McDonald's through them, not putting a Starbucks at the top of that peak. In other words, like, how do you balance increasing access with conservation moving forward? Because I mean, it's kind of the balance of the work of BHA, I would imagine.
Yeah, and there's certainly no one size fits all answer, and I think you know at a very high level, you keep public lands in public hands, and and
Uh-huh.
you don't privatize them, and that's a first start, right? And within then the framework that we have to manage these lands, you have uh, you know the various laws that govern the multiple use mandate of our public lands and waters, and I think from there you have to allow for public input and broad stakeholder input to say how we should be managing access and you know allowing for the multiple uses of our public lands. And so that's a very 1,000 foot view. You have to have this framework, that people have to be involved, but then when you get into some of these more like zoomed in discussions about particular areas and managing impacts, I think within the context of hunting, you know, there is a carrying capacity for the wildlife, right?
Uh-huh.
And so let's talk about the Eastern Sierra, right? Like X
Uh-huh.
zone tags for deer, they're not easy to draw. Somehow I did not draw this year with my, I don't know, 9 points, which was a
Oh,
shocker.
wow. Wow. Yeah.
It's of course, I think I had a couple of friends bringing me down there on the party, but we were very close, but still didn't draw. And so you have like a natural regulating mechanism there from a hunting perspective, just for in a lot of areas, because there's only so many tags that they give out, so there's only going to be so
Uh-huh.
many hunters out in the field. When it comes to just outdoor recreation in general, I think there's a lot of science that has been established and that continues to come out that shows those impacts to wildlife from just
Uh-huh.
all sorts of outdoor recreation. And it, I think that the conversation here, and maybe I'll be leaning a little bit more into like the individual side, although BHA certainly kind of um, weighted in here in various respects over the years. But you have to look at like, how are we funding conservation work? From the hunting perspective,
Uh-huh.
we've got Pittman Robertson funding in that hunting and licenses and tags and everything, and the industry
Uh-huh.
goods. These all go into supporting conservation of wildlife. Outdoor recreation in general, there's no quote unquote backpack tax, and so I think that's part of it too, right? Like, how are we
Uh-huh.
paying into the system to ensure that we're conserving these areas? And then I think that there at a certain point, you do have to have the conversation about just managing. use, right? And so sometimes that involves like you have to get a permit to go into certain areas, how we've, managed some of our backcountry landscapes. And it's less than ideal, but, I think people have generally shown a willingness to want to apply for, let's say you're in Montana and you want to float the Smith River. Like you'd rather
Mm-hmm.
put in for a permit to float the Smith River and wait a couple years than go out there and have it be completely impacted and not really have a good experience, right? You'd rather
Mm-hmm.
maybe not go every year, go every other year and have a much better experience. And so I think that those all factor into how we manage use. But when it comes to just advocating for access and access for all, I mean, certainly whoever you are, you have a right to go and recreate and experience public lands in the way that you want. It's just
Mm-hmm.
make, having a high level perspective of understanding what our impacts are and balancing those impacts and the multiple uses of our public lands to make sure that, you know, we're not causing irreparable harm and we're not diminishing the wildlife species and the fish species that we want to see, you know, sustained and exist for future generations.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, so I, this is something that we haven't really gotten into, which is the more of the policy side of this whole topic. We get into a lot on this podcast, like the spiritual side. What does it do? What does nature do for you, and all these things. But there is a very real there are very real political aspects and economic and policy aspects, but behind what allows us to even recreate on public lands or private recreate in North America. um for folks who maybe some of our listeners who don't really understand, you're just talking about like how hunting and fishing provides the vast majority or a large percentage, at least, of funds for conservation in the United States. And then you mentioned something like a backpack tax, which we can get to because I am wildly in favor of such a such an issue. But can you break it down the North American model for people just here, like like on like a maybe a elementary kindergarten level? Like, what are we actually talking about here when we're talking about like conservation of public lands and what role hunting and fishing and other outdoor uh, pursuits play in that model?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the North American model of conservation is really unique the world own, right? Like it's something that really only exists here and that people have pointed to as being, you know, incredibly successful. And it involves, using hunting as a conservation tool and managing hunting in order to ensure that we have, science-based management of our wildlife, that we're not um, hunting things to the point of extirpation. And when you look back
Mm-hmm.
100 years, there are a number of species in North America that were really
Mm-hmm.
struggling, at the verge of extirpation and an extinction. Even we look at like buffalo. That's
Mm-hmm.
the case of like really getting close, really getting down to
Mm-hmm.
the wire, and almost single digits. And so, but I think another great example would be like wild turkeys,
Yep.
and the success story for how we've been able to manage hunting and conservation and hunting pressure and regulated hunting to really bring those species back. And a core component of that is, using the dollars from hunting and fishing to fund conservation work. And so, part of the North American model is ensuring that, wildlife is a public trust. It's a
Mm-hmm.
resource that is to be managed, in the public trust, and there should be democratic kind of access to wildlife species. And so, these are resources that we all own, just like the concept we're all public landowners. We're all,
Mm-hmm.
stewards and owners of the wildlife here. And so there has to be a process, right, where we're ensuring that these species can exist in perpetuity, but also that we can, have equal access to be able to go hunt and fish. And so when you look at the system that we have in place for hunting, through licenses and tags, this is ensuring that there is democratic access to these public trust resources. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there's only X number of deer in the Eastern Sierra. And if you want to hunt this particular zone, which is beautiful and, has, all the things that you would want to have in a hunt, like, well, you might have to, like me, you might have to wait a decade before you draw that tag. And then it's going to be a great experience. Or if you want to hunt a bighorn sheep, you might have to wait a lifetime.
A lifetime, if at
Right.
all. Right. Yeah.
If at all. I mean, I hope I
Yeah.
can, I hope it's going to be within my lifetime. But right, that your ability to hunt those species is directly related to the amount of money that is invested into conservation of those species and like
Uh-huh.
active management, right? And so through regulated hunting, through the sale of hunting licenses and tags and archery equipment and firearms equipment, like there is this federal excise tax that um, goes towards conservation, and that money gets put into states and is matched and amplified, and that is how we've managed to bring and support a lot of different fish and wildlife species and do a ton of work on the ground. And I think that's the core of the model, really, that we're
Uh-huh.
talking about.
Yeah. I mean, and it is, and it's been wildly successful, and it's, because historically, and we're talking, hundreds of years ago, hunters, I mean, were responsible for, yeah, the near extirpation of a number of species, but then also due to the North American conservation model, have also been largely responsible for their return, which is the irony of it. You mentioned the wild turkeys, and yeah, I mean, I grew up in Ohio, and when I was growing up, I grew up on a horse farm, and it's heavily wooded, and there were always lots of deer. Now there's an excess amount of deer, but there were always lots of deer, but there were never any wild turkeys when I grew up. Now, when I go back to Ohio and I go back to that farm, I mean, there's turkeys everywhere. They're they're abundant on the land, right? And I think a lot of that is due to um, the money that came in from hunters and fishermen, so that they could repopulate some of those turkey populations in Ohio and in throughout North America. But there's this concept, and I think we've had conversations about this, and I've had conversations about it with other hunters and other people, is that, and I think it can be rather controversial when you mention it, but it's this concept of like a backpack tax, right? What is that, and what would that even look like, man?
Yeah, I mean, again, this one, I wouldn't say that BHA has like a fully formulated policy on this one, so it's a bit,
Mm-hmm.
off the cuff for me. But I think again, just building on what the concept is of, Pittman Robertson, and we pay into this system to be able to utilize this resource. That's the core
Right.
concept, right? So like hunters are understanding they have an impact if they want to see wildlife species thrive. That we need to fund conservation work, and we recognize the impact that we have, but through this funding mechanism, then that impact can be not only offset, but even, we can be growing in most areas. And ideally we're expanding, the health and habitat of these species and not having a detrimental impact, but ideally even going the other direction, which
Mm-hmm.
there's so many different pressures from society that, that's a tough hill to climb in a lot of cases because there's so many impacts to wildlife. But the concept of a backpack tax, right, is you have all these different uses of our public lands. You've got people that are out there just hiking. You've got people that are out there mountain biking. Um, in some places where it's allowed, you've got motorized, OHV use, and OHV does have like certain buckets of money that in certain states you've got like programs where you pay into it, but particularly I think for the examples of like hiking and climbing and
Mm.
mountain biking and riding your e-bike, like these are uh, impact on wildlife. There's very clearly
Mm-hmm.
documented scientific studies of the impacts that these activities have on wildlife and notable declines in wildlife health and bird health. Year over year, right? You've seen like these precipitous declines, particularly in some of the areas where you've done the studies, Colorado,
Mm-hmm.
and other areas. And so you track this, and if we're having an impact, one would hope that like these different user groups, like hunters and anglers, would want to offset their impacts by paying into a system, because we enjoy these public lands and waters. And I think
Hmm.
you have so many different outdoor brands that, you know, are very successful and provide great products. There's nothing wrong with that. But also, you know, I think that we should recognize that outdoor recreation it does come with an impact, right? And as population
Hmm.
increases, we need to make sure that we're not enjoying our public lands to death. And that doesn't mean don't go out there and recreate. It means that we need to invest and have a mechanism to support our wildlife and our public lands to ensure, access. And honestly, like if you look at like a perfect segue there into like another policy issue is that the deferred maintenance backlog for our public lands, for our federal public lands, is
Hmm.
like over $40 billion,
Mm.
and uh, we allocated money towards the deferred maintenance backlog in the Great American Outdoors Act, which
Hmm.
fully funded this great program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But it also allocated this money towards our deferred maintenance backlog. And even with
Hmm.
that 1.6 million a year, it's still almost doubled. And so
Yeah.
right now, there is a bill to uh, allocate $2 billion a year to address our deferred maintenance backlog. Um, and like this is just a no-brainer thing that we need to advance.
Hmm.
Where BHA, and this gets into the weeds of policy, like we're a little bit worried that there will be some politicking as it goes to Senator Lee, who folks might recall was notoriously at the helm of the 2 to 3 million acres of
Mm.
public lands that were
Hmm.
for sale earlier this summer. And we're
Hmm.
afraid that he might try to take a swing at this great LWCF program that
Hmm.
just expands access for public lands, all over the nation. But yeah, I mean, that's what we're talking about here, right? We need to invest. We need to fund our public lands. We need people there. We need staff within
Hmm.
the Forest Service and BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service. And, we've just seen those agencies really get hollowed out. And I mean, the government shut down, right? There's nobody right now really that's doing the work. And so
Right.
those impacts are going to be seen, and really the impacts from previous shutdowns have been tremendous to our public lands, and
Hmm.
really detrimental.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and here's the thing that I always, I think a backpack tax would be wonderful. And also, as a hunter and fisherman, it also would be in a way contrary to my best interest or my best outdoor recreation interest, because I think one of the things that hunters and anglers have largely hung their hat on over the years especially politically in a lobbying sense, is that like saying the fact that, yeah, like we do provide a large percentage of the funds for conservation in North America. And so we should have, so we should be funding things that, promote bears or promote elk or promote deer, or promote some of these, quote unquote game species. Um, but recreations like birders are increasingly large in percentage. I used to, and I don't climb as much as I used to anymore, but rock climbing, as you mentioned, has a pretty large effect on wildlife, especially raptors, nesting raptors. And we don't really give anything to conservation except for, I mean, there's different funds, there, access fund and things like that do, but not on a federal level, right? And so I think it's always the thing is like, and so, but for me personally, is that, yeah, I mean, I love to hunt fish and I love to be outdoors. And what I'm mostly concerned about and my biggest passion is conserving more wildlife, more ecosystems, more land. And it's not necessarily, for me at least, my own individual best interest that I have in mind. Because I think if something like a backpack tax was ever implemented, meaning like we would tax backpacks, hiking shoes, whatever, I don't know, climbing equipment, something like that, an excess tax of, I don't know, whatever it would be, that would go 1% or whatever, that would go to conservation. you know, I think hunters and anglers would probably have less of a say at the table. And um and is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I think it's largely speculation, to be quite honest with you. Um but like I said, I mean, for me, in my own personal interests are not necessarily, can I hunt and fish in the future? Although, yes, that is extremely important, but more of it is like conserving public lands, conserving wildlife, conserving, the rivers and the mountains and the places that I love for everyone to use. And so I really would be in favor of something like a backpack tax. I mean, I don't know. The prospects of it, though, I don't think kind of, who knows? Probably,
I think there's been industry opposition there, but I'm with
yeah.
you. I mean, it's a very fair argument as far as like the political capital and clout that the hunting and angling community has because of that funding and our ability to, I think every hunter wears that with pride.
Hmm.
But I also think that, I would hope that we could continue to move in a direction where just recognizing that we can't afford to not, have this funding, right? Especially when you look at
Hmm.
the state of kind of multiple threats to public lands and what we're looking at as far as big issues that we need to deal with invasive species and
Hmm.
just how we manage things that it's kind of an all hands on deck. And not to be alarmist and to say the sky is
Hmm.
falling, because I also feel like we're kind of in the golden age of hunting and fishing in a lot of respects as well.
For sure,
But it's
for
one of
sure.
those things where it's like, we have to have both. We need a seat at the table and can never give that up, but we also need to, you know, bring in additional sources of funding wherever we can for our
Yeah.
public lands and waters. Because if we don't, like, you know, I think we're going to continue to see uh, declines, right? Like in California,
Hmm.
look at our deer herd declines. It's
Hmm.
just, we need to do something about it. And for 60 years, we haven't been able to reverse that decline. And so how do we, a lot of that is development pressure. A lot of that is like,
For sure.
just expanding into the wild and urban interface and
Right.
predator management and all the different things that you can point to. But at the end of the day, like you throw money at an issue and you can start to improve it. We could plant a whole lot more bitter brush if we have more money behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially like you just mentioned, the California deer herd, right, has been dwindling for what, the past 50 years or something like that. But it's not one issue. You can't just target one issue and address it, right? You can, one of the things I know you've been a proponent of, and I clearly am as well, but is, like predator management, black bear management, um, because they, not that we can talk about the amount of uh deer that bears steal from mountain lions is astronomically high. Um, but that's just one issue, as you said, facing deer. It's also cars. It's also, like you said, habitat loss from development, from wildfires, from invasive species. And so, I mean, I am curious. What do you? Because as the Western Conservation Policy Manager, I don't. Does your does that extend up into Alaska as well, or is it just like the continental lower 48 states? What is that?
It does.
Okay,
Technically,
wow.
like the purview for like my policy area is Alaska to Montana to Texas into California, and we have a great staffer, Mary Glaves, who's in Alaska, who is really like the tip of the spear,
Uh-huh.
and she's like the champion for our Alaska policy work, and so I would say I back her up. In some respects. But
Uh-huh.
it is a focus, right, of my work, and we do weave that in, and I do spend a good bit of time on Alaska issues as well.
Well, okay. So then my question is then, what do you think are the biggest issues facing public lands, facing wildlife in North America? It's been maybe narrow that down to Western North America and the region that you cover. What are our biggest issues that we're facing now and perhaps in the
Man,
future?
biggest issues. It's a tough one. I could I could take a few different angles there. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues is the concept of connectivity and of fragmenting habitat, and
Hmm.
and the way that we have, and this ties into roadless, this ties into so many different things, but like the way that we have developed and built highways and roads and
Uh,
uh you know development and Starbucks, whatever it is, like in
mhm,
these traditional migration corridors, movement pathways, or maybe you could even frame that as, like infrastructure, like a dam, right, where we're blocking
Mm,
movement for anadromous fish. And I think that that is the core, right? Because the connectivity between these species and the necessity for species to be able to move, migrate, and to adapt, particularly in a changing climate, is everything.
mm,
And if we isolate species and we cut them off so they're genetically isolated or they don't have the ability to move and adapt in a changing climate, because let's face it, our climate has been, changing. These, wildlife have evolved throughout a number of different ice ages and changing changes of climate, and so I do feel like things are accelerating, and I certainly am a believer in climate change. But I'm just saying that, like, wildlife in general can adapt. It is important that we give them the pathways to be able to adapt and to move
mhm.
um, in the face of these different threats. So I would say that's probably the biggest one, um, because you can then, it's kind of a little bit of a cheater answer because you can then like add in all the different things like, oh,
Right.
it's the infrastructure and the dams here, or it's the
Hmm.
pollution from this place here, and they can be the death by a thousand cuts. But
For sure.
I think that's one of the core things that I am interested in my work, and it's led me to do projects like our bitterbrush planting or the
Hmm.
wildlife crossing project down in Southern California for peninsula bighorn sheep, or
Mm.
guzzlers to help connect different species across their range. I think it's just like there's an endless amount of work that we can do there. And, particularly in California, when you talk about wildlife crossings, I mean,
Mm.
we are like way behind the times there. And there's a lot of investment and energy there, but, you know, we're still trying to get our first crossings up. I mean, I think our first one was established actually for butterflies, interestingly, in Southern California, but really don't have a whole lot of infrastructure there. And there's a lot of states with, 50, 60 wildlife overpasses.
Mhm.
And it's just necessary infrastructure. We have to invest in that because, yeah, there's thousands of deer getting hit by cars every year.
Yeah.
Talk about
Yeah.
stemming the decline of our deer herd. Let's just let them safely migrate across the freeway.
Mhm. Well, I mean, we have they just built within the past what 2 years Liberty Crossing, um, down in up in LA. That's one that was largely funded. I mean, that's not a BHA project at all, but that was largely funded privately through the Annenberg Foundation, and I would argue was largely promoted by P22, the mountain lion that was in Griffith Park living for 8 years. But that's an entirely different subject. And and they're actually building a wildlife crossing right by my house, on the 395 up in Walker. So, which, well, it's, in fact, it is built. They're just putting up the fences and putting in some more of the think just some of the foliage and some native grasses and things that to help the deer move through that. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I don't know about you, man, but like I think we can live in this world where it's like the sky is falling, all of these things are happening, and I think especially. I mean, from your perspective, probably that may be intensified a bit more because, you're in the policy, you're in the trenches every day and always putting out a lot of fires, right? Um, I mean, that's a lot of the work that you do. And listen, I, I want you to know, I really appreciate that work because it's not work that I want to do. So thank you for doing it. Um, and we need more people like you out there in the trenches doing that stuff, man. Um, but I'm curious, man, like, because you said habitat fragmentation is the biggest threat, which, as you said, is like, gosh, it's a huge issue to actually cover because there's removal of dams, there's wildlife crossings, there's habitat restoration, there's all of these different things in that. What do you? I mean, as somebody who has I don't know, you could agree with this or not necessarily, but has somewhat at least of a pulse on the future of conservation in America because you're having these conversations every day of the week. what hope do you have? I mean, what hope for you do you think is there for the future of our public lands in this country? Because in one stroke, you said we're in the golden age of hunting and fishing. I think there's definitely to be an argument to be made there, right? And then on the other, it's like, well, the biggest threat is habitat fragmentation, and there's all these different things to do to mitigate that. So, yeah, what does the future look like for public lands if you could you know, wave your magic wand or look into your sorcerer's ball. What do you think, man?
To tie this like into the policy realm too, I think it is something that we have seen, particularly like, let's just like, if we're looking at connectivity and that issue, right, and we're expanding from there for like how do we really like kind of make gains. um you know the previous Trump administration, we had uh Secretarial Order 3362 and this amazing, bipartisan effort to improve connectivity for big game species. And states got on board and published their state wildlife action plans. And, we had federal funding through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and all these different grants to, okay, we've got this top down priority. Let's, address some of these connectivity issues and for Western big game migration. And, that there's like a lot of momentum there on both sides of the aisle. And then, a lot of that funding was impacted initially in this first administration. Like a lot of our work that we were doing, that we had to furlough a few people just because
Mhm.
like of the funding freezes. And, we've got them back now, which is great. Really, really excited about that. And, but I think it's just, getting away from like some of the partisan nature of how we manage our public lands and the like back and
Mm.
forth to the point where we can just identify these areas that are clearly bipartisan, like the Great American Outdoors Act and LWCF funding, like SO3362, and like the importance of wildlife crossings and these things that are, there's always going to be areas that people argue about for multiple uses. And
Mhm.
should we have a mine here, or should we drill for oil and gas there, or should that be a solar field? Like those those multiple uses and those push pull pressures will always be there. We need to have good safeguards, so we're trying to steer those away from fish and wildlife habitat, from the
Mhm.
places that are important for hunting and fishing. Like that is critical. But I also think like we need to focus the majority of our effort into these areas where like everybody is in agreement that we need to move these policies forward, and then stick to them and remind people that they're very bipartisan in nature. And so I would say the
Extremely.
future is have a government that functions and is not shut down. That we fund our Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. We have people that are actually out there in the field doing this restoration work, and that
Mhm.
these projects are not shut down, and that we have people that are active and participate in the process to like let their elected officials know they care about this stuff and they want to see investments, and
Yep.
then actually going out and volunteering and helping their BLM staff to put plants in the ground or rip down old barbed wire fence or whatever it is. Like I think the future relies on people being engaged in that way. And yeah, maybe a little extra funding here and there from whatever sources we can get to restore habitat. But that's the way I see it. I'm very optimistic despite all the kind of sky is falling threats of the
Yeah.
to public lands for the last year. I still think it's a very bipartisan issue that we can absolutely bring like people from the very most diverse, kind of sides of the political spectrum to agree. Like this, everybody wants this. Everybody wants clean water. You know,
Mhm.
who doesn't want clean water from their forest service? But
Yep.
I don't think people realize that that comes from public lands, right? Huge amount of your
Yeah.
drinking water is
Yeah.
filtered and comes from your public land. So don't screw it up.
Yeah, no, I listen, we share that optimism, which is one of the reasons why I asked that question. I don't adhere to a sky is falling mentality, even though I do recognize some of the very real threats. I, as you said, I think I very clearly people want public lands, very clearly and very resoundingly people want to protect them. They want the right to hunt, fish, and or recreate in whatever the way they feel fit safely and ethically on public lands. And I personally, for one, feel like the future is pretty bright. You know, whenever I wear my public lands t-shirt and I'm walking around and, you know, people question it like, oh, how'd you become a public landowner? I'm like, well, you are too, you know, sort of thing. And I love having those conversations. But Devin, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you got a hard stop here in a minute. So is there anything that you want to leave folks with, or maybe let folks know how they can find you or find BHA in case they're interested in yeah, learning more about the work that you all do over there with public lands?
Yeah, yeah. So for our wild public lands, waters, wildlife, that's kind of like BHA's core there. I always got to add in the wild too, because sometimes
Mm-hmm.
forget that, you know, really like that's the focus, right? Those wild places. If people want to get involved, you know, I would go to backcountryhunters.org as a starting point. You know, our organization is primarily funded through memberships, and so you know, $35 membership goes a really long way towards having people on the ground to be able to do this work, coordinate these projects, and advocate and let you know about what you know policies are moving and things are happening. Uh, that's the very easiest thing you can possibly do. The thing that I would say is, you know, and for people that are interested in becoming like more involved in the organization is, you know, conversations you and I have had, right, over the years is like what areas are you interested in? Like what are you personally passionate about? Where do you like to recreate? Um, and then working backwards, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
find something that you care about and then connect with, you know, your local BHA chapter, let them know you want to organize a stewardship project. Maybe that's just as simple as a trash back out, but maybe it's something where we connect with the biologists and see what their priorities are. And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like you all have been, you know, helping with, you know, electroshocking and, you know, native
Mm-hmm.
fish restoration in the Eastern Sierra. Like those things can come together with like pretty little bit, just a little bit of connection and a few,
Yeah.
you know, emails and phone calls and you can bring a whole bunch of people out there and coordinate an event to really make a tangible difference. And so, you know, yes, support the organization. Yes, call your representatives, call your senators, like do these things, but also like figure out where it is that you really want to make an impact. And then, you know, I think there's a lot of organizations, not just BHA, that would love to try to leverage your voice and your you know actions on the ground to actually like make a tangible impact that's gonna last more than you know just that one phone call.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that, brother. Got to get people out there, man. You got to people get them advocating for public lands and advocating for wildlife. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Devin, thank you, brother. I really appreciate the work you do. I know you know that. But I'm very serious. The next time we see each other, it should really be around a campfire instead of in front of a computer screen, my friend.
Yeah, let's commit to that one.
Absolutely, brother. All right, man. Well, thank you for your time. And yeah, we'll catch you later, man.
All right, appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to The Wild Lab. If today's conversation stirred something in you and you're ready to connect to your own inner wildness, then check us out online on Instagram at Step Into Your Wild, or go on over to www.stepintoyourwild.com to learn more about our coaching services and wilderness academies offered through Walker's School of the Wild. Look, this is real work for real people who want to live with more clarity, more purpose, and more strength, but you don't have to figure it out alone. Let's walk this road together. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and stay wild.